Thank you for having me here. I actually enjoy talking a bit about the relevance that social interaction might have for people dealing or interested in cognitive robotics. So, what we know from recent research, both in the field of AI and in the field of robotics in general, is that there are a lot of seemingly super complex problems that our systems have already partially solved. So we have computers that win at chess or Go or StarCraft, and we have robots that are doing backflips with not such a big problem. But whenever we come to encounters between a robot and a human, problems arise. And that's puzzling because, well, I definitely cannot do a backflip. But since age 4, maybe even earlier, I definitely understood if a person was handing its hand toward me what this person meant, or that I had to pass an object that the person needed. Whereas this seemingly easy task are super complex apparently for our machines. And if we look at human development, we realize that indeed, instead, for us, those abilities of understanding others, predicting and anticipating others are actually at the root of our development. Since birth, first hours after we are alive, out of the womb, we are able to detect whether a movement is of biological nature or not. And we can detect that there are faces, and soon later we can also know whether those faces are looking at us or not looking at us. And imagine, even before we learn to properly use language, we are already able to understand an action of another person in terms of its goals. So there are this beautiful example of instrumental helping, which means that if a very, very young child sees someone trying to pass through the door with their hand blocked by, I don't know, a pile of books, well, the child will open the door for this person, which means that the child has understood and predicted the unfulfilled goal of the person and has done something to help. We would want from robots to do that, but that's particularly complicated and an inherently cognitive task, which is predicting, anticipating what's going to happen, what the other person is going to need. And the fact that we grow, that we develop our abilities this way, starting from the very beginning with a sort of special attention to social information, makes it so that our perception of the world is significantly different from the perception of the world that a machine has. So, whereas a camera that our robot has or its sensor are taking picture or accurate representation of what's there around the robot, our brain is doing so much more. It's continuously reshaping the inputs that are coming from our senses and enriching them through our prior experience, for instance, our motor knowledge, our goal, what we are interested in the moment, and even a lot of cognitive biases that we have developed, or actually we have evolved, I don't know, to bring a sort of facilitation in paying attention to what might matter most and might facilitate us to be successful in our interaction with the environment and with others. Giulio Sandini in the past formulated this very nice sentence, if you want, so that we see the world through anthropomorphic eyes, which is also a citation from a written essay by Italo Calvino about this idea that our mind cannot be anything else than anthropomorphic. In which sense? In the sense that we are not seeing things for what they are for real, but we translate them by using our knowledge of our body, for instance, our motor knowledge. Let me give you some practical and, if you want, very well-known example. And this is the case of the mirror neuron system. So we have in our brain several areas that fire, that respond, both when we are performing an action and when we are observing someone else performing the same action. This means that we have a sort of direct match, a sort of motor vocabulary that allows me to easily, in some sense, understand and even predict what the other is gonna do, exactly because I can map it on what I wanted to do when I was performing that particular action. And this has important implication. This means, for instance, that biological motion and the structure of the body have a special relevance to our eyes. There are some regularities, both in the kinematics and in the dynamics of someone's movement, which we are sensitive to. So we don't realize it, but our brain is processing them in a special fashion and using them to understand others. And this brings in a lot of benefits that we would love to have on our machines. So the fact that you can actually establish imitation, automatic imitation. So if I walk along the street, you take my speed, even without realizing it. It's just a mechanism that is also called motor resonance. Or prediction. So thanks to your expertise in performing a task, your brain knows how to predict how it will go to another person. So if you're an expert mini golf player and you're seeing someone else throwing the ball, even before the ball probably leaves the stick, you will know whether the ball will enter the hole or not. This is something that comes out as a gift thanks to our own direct motor experience. And it becomes even more complicated that, because we know that usually our brain plans our motion to minimize some cost. Usually it's a minimum jerk or a minimum energy, minimum effort, and that's good. But that's not the whole truth, because when we are embedded in a social setting, our brains sometimes make different decisions and decide to spend more effort just to become more comprehensible to the other partner. So you are discounting or losing energy, putting effort to be communicative. And the classic example is that of signaling, for instance, in which you change the way you move, you amplify the way you move in a way that you'd not do naturally, were you alone, because this way the collaboration is facilitated because it's clearer to your partner what you're gonna do. So, what we want? Well, since we have all this system naturally functioning in our brain, it means that for us, any action is per se a form of communication. So just by looking at Carlo passing the plush to our robot iCub, I see a lot of things. iCub sees just a movement. That's it. An object is moved from A to B. What I see an intention. I see Carlo wants to pass the plush to iCub. I see how the attitude of Carlo is toward the iCub. I mean, looking at their face and the posture, I can think, well, probably Carlo is not gonna hit iCub. He seems to like it. And I have also an intuition about how Carlo feels about the plush. I mean, the plush is really a non-fragile object, but you see with which care Carlo is using it, which means that it has a careful attitude. So now I'm talking a lot about this. This analysis is something that your brain does without your awareness, just by seeing a moment of this action. And this implies that were you in place of ICAB, you'd know what to expect. You'd know how to adapt. You'd know how to react in advance. Whereas ICAB, poor guy at the moment, is blind to all this information. And so his prediction about what's going to happen is really, really impoverished. So our effort in the past years has been to try and endow our robots with a bit of these predictive abilities. And this requires several steps. The first step is to make the robot sensitive. So let's say, starting from what we know about the basis of human social cognition, can we direct the attention of the ICAB to the signals that are hidden in plain sight in the way we move? And just to give example, we started by endowing the robot with the ability to read facial expression. There are several ways and several models of affect. You know, we went for very basic representation, like the Russell valence arousal plane. Not with the ambition to really claim that we understand the emotion of the partner, which is maybe a bit too much, but at least this way the robot can have a sense of the reaction, the state response that people have when they are interacting with it. This is an exercise in which Julia is trying to learn how to balance this inverted pendulum, and it's a difficult task. We made it difficult. And ICAB is playing the role of a trainer, and she's using another robot, the wristbot, that can provide actually assistance. And what we found out is that the robot, of course, can monitor the training, the learning success through the performance. But if you combine that with also the monitoring of the facial expression, you can have a more complete representation of what's happening in the person that undergoing the training. And in particular, we realized that the facial expression could reveal very well which were the most challenging tasks or moments in the exercise. And in principle, the idea is to combine this quantitative measure of performance with this information about the facial expression to actually have a more holistic representation of the state of a trainee or of a patient, also maybe to understand when it's better to stop doing the training. Another precious source of information is actually how we move and how we deal with objects. So we found out that even disregarding the face and just looking at how people move, especially interacting with objects, we can have a good sense whether they are expressing a special attitude, like a gentle or an aggressive style, or if they're just moving, you know, neutrally, but at different speeds. And interestingly, we can detect that even if we remove the body from the equation and we just look at information coming from the object itself. So this is a sensorized object that we developed at IIT, which is a very simple cube that has also the ability to sense how it is rotated in space and how it is touched on its surfaces. And we use that to explore manipulation, visual haptic exploration. And more recently, we found out that just by reading tactile information during the exploration, during the interaction with the object, and rotation information, you can have a decent sense of how the people manipulating it are feeling in terms of aggressiveness or kindness, with a decent accuracy. And we also explored the possibility to understand which kind of emotion the participants were enacting just by measuring, again, only the information coming from the cube. And we found out that it is indeed possible especially if you combine information about rotation and information about tactile contacts. And it's interesting because, as you see, there is no pressure information, which is usually what you use in haptic contacts to understand emotional traits, but it is possible even without them if you use rotation and tactile maps. Another important state that we wanted to investigate recently was comfortability. So, since we recognize that it is very difficult to infer the emotional state of a person that is in front of us during a short interaction, and we can't be sure that the robot is able to do that, at least we want to know if the robot is doing something terribly wrong. Am I making you uncomfortable? So, what we wanted to do with Elena was, can we endow the robot with the ability at least to detect whether something is going on wrongly in the interaction? So she defined the term comfortability. It's a new term in the field, and she tried to manipulate that with the robot. So we have a robot who played the role of a nasty interviewer. We interviewed almost 30 researchers in our institute, asking them about their research, but also about their thoughts, hobbies, and ideas about the future after coronavirus, etc. But the interesting structure of the interview, this is an example. I'm speaking over it just to be, so the ICAB is asking, for instance, what's your name, what do you do, oh, that's very nice, where are you coming from? It's a very typical press interview, if you want. And indeed, we designed it with the press office of our institute, so we had the help of a journalist to be credible in some sense. And the interviews have been published and had a press outcome so that the researchers were presented also online. But the interview was designed to have a first half meant to trigger positive comfortability, to make you feel well. And the second part meant to trigger uncomfortability. So the robot started forgetting your name and calling you with a different name, or, you know, blubbering, so saying things that do not make sense, and or making errors like, sorry, I didn't understood, could you repeat? No, I still don't understand, could you repeat? No, I don't understand, please repeat this. And we wanted to know whether this very clear way of showing robot failure on the social domain could manipulate the actual comfortability of the person. Plus, there were a few neutral sentences just to make the interview decent, and also some direct questions of the robot at the end of each phase. So, how are you feeling about the interview? And what we found out was that thanks God, the negative comfortability triggers managed to reduce the comfortability of people, at least from their self-report. But it's interesting that if we look at what participants actually told to the robot during the interview, they didn't want to reveal that they were feeling uncomfortable. And so this tells us that asking is nice, but sometimes it doesn't reveal the whole truth. And that's also the reason why we started looking at the audio-video files. And this is an example in which the robot was asking, how are you feeling? And the person replied, oh, yes, nice, it was good, it was fine. But if you look at the facial expression, at the way the person was moving, you can realize that, well, nice is okay, but it's not nice. So what we couldn't find out is that by looking at the data set collected, there are several non-verbal information hidden there that the robot could use to realize that he did something wrong about the interview. And therefore, we went on with an annotation. We asked, actually, it was Elena personally annotating at a level of comfortability for all the pieces of videos, just by monitoring the visual information, so not even audio. And by using those data set with the training, we found out that monitoring features related to the facial expression, the gaze, and also some information about the body pose, and the action units, so how your face muscles, let's say, change, you can have a sense, indeed, of how that specific person is feeling about the interaction with you. And it's still not very robust across people, so I have to interact with you to know about you and your comfortability, and I cannot generalize to him, for instance, not very well at least. But we are studying now whether there are other sources of information, maybe multimodal, maybe going to audio, that could help in the process. The idea here is to endow the robot with the ability to know what's happening and then to be able then to decide how to act consequently. Of course, I spoke of movement, I spoke of actions, even objects, but one of the most precious sources of information is gaze. In the past, we used it effectively to understand what's the goal of a person. And we found out that just gaze direction alone is a super rich information. So if we make the robot blind to any other source of information and it can only see where you're looking at, it has already a very good chance of passing you the right object at the right time. So that was pretty nice. More recently, we wanted to look at different sources of information, and we moved to study the pupillary response, so pupillary dilation. There is this very well-known phenomenon by which when your cognitive load is high, like now, when you're trying to process what I'm saying, your pupil becomes wider. And it's well known, but we didn't know whether this is something that's robust enough that can be factually used for a robot to understand your state, whether you're experiencing too much cognitive load. So we designed an experiment in which we asked you either to tell the truth or to lie toward the robot in an interrogation scenario, like police situation, or to a human experimenter. And we found out that pupil dilation is a very robust phenomenon that works well both when you are lying to a robot as when you're lying to a human. So we could clearly understand that your pupils were wider when you were lying. So our question was, well, yes, but in real life, thankfully, we don't need every time to pass through interrogation. Does this work in a more realistic interaction? And therefore, we design a game. And in this game, you have a lot of cards that have drawings. And you have to describe the cards. And you can either describe them truthfully, or you have to invent a creative story about them. And the robot is handling autonomously the whole game, so it's showing you the cards. And what it does, it's reading the information coming from the eye tracker about the pupil dilation, and it's trying to use that information alone to try and guess whether you're lying or not. So this is the first version. You have 6 cards, and you have to decide on just one of them to lie. So what we are doing is just collecting the mean pupil dilation during the 6th card, and we found a heuristic. The card for which the pupil dilation is the highest, that is the lying one. And if you just apply this basic heuristic, you have a very high accuracy. It's around 88%. Then we wanted to be a bit stronger, and so we started asking people, okay, now that you've done that, now you draw a card and you decide. You can lie or tell the truth, and you can do that as many times you want. And we just did again the heuristic. We said, if it's closer to the pupil dilation when you lied the first time, it is a lie. If it's closer, if it's far away from that, it's much lower, then it's a truth. And by doing this simple heuristic, again, you have a decent accuracy, 70%. But if you progressively then let the robot adapt. So if after each card I ask you if I was right or not, guessing whether you were lying, and then I readapt the thresholds progressively, I increase my accuracy even to 78%. And of course, when we collected enough participants, we wanted to see whether this could generalize to other people randomly. And with a bit of tentatives, I would say that what works best is an anomaly detection, while you assume that lying is the anomaly and telling the truth is the normality. Also because our data set was, of course, a bit imbalanced. And there you find out that still, with this unimodal, unique information, you are quite good at guessing. And we also wondered, well, how do we fare with respect to humans? And so we performed an online task. We showed the very same videos that we collected during the experiment of people describing cards to a cohort of people online, and we asked them to guess whether the person was lying or telling the truth, and how sure they were about that, and also why do you say so? What did you see that made you convinced? And also, we picked also a few videos that were the ones for which the robot was right, and few videos for which our algorithm failed. And these are the results. So first of all, we humans are not that good at detecting lies, and that's very, very bearing with the literature. So this is a percentage that it's also reported on studies that just focus on lie detection. But the interesting thing we found out was that people were incredibly better where ICAB failed. And so we were, oh, interesting, maybe we can combine the two efforts. And why is it so? Well, we looked at the features that pushed the decision of participants, and in their cases, it was a lot about both prosody, about the way they talked and the way they moved. All things that, by constructions, our robot didn't care about. So this is interesting because it tells us that we as humans can enact strategies to compensate for this pupil dilation or increase of cognitive load, which usually manifest as changes in our prosody and in the way we talk. And so if we have a system that is able to sense both, we significantly increase our chances of understanding whether the person in front of us is facing a cognitive load intensive kind of task. Recently, we moved on and we thought maybe beyond predicting whether you're experiencing a cognitive load, we might also want to know something more. So if I face you with a risky situation, let's imagine a social engineering, a cyber attack, will you realize that? Will you fall into the trap? So will you accept a risky situation? Can I predict whether you do that or not? So we designed a video game, actually. This is work by Dario Pasquali. And because we wanted to have a situation in which the person could be at risk without being for real at risk. So there was this adventure in which you had to make a lot of decisions about what to do or what not to do. And you had some precious resources like your ID or your life. And you were faced with the 28 proposals. Some of them were not risky. Some of them were traditional risk, and we extracted them from a classic questionnaire about risk. And then some of them were threat. So like a social engineering attacks performed by an agent in the game or by our robot. And we measured several physiological response in addition to the pupil dilation. And what we found out was that indeed, participants detected there were risk. We know that in acceptance rate that drops when the request was risky, and even when it is a social engineering risk, it's still lower than the baseline. But we also noticed some interesting patterns in their electrodermal activity and in their pupil. And what we found out was that it is actually possible to have a sense from this source of information of what the person is perceiving, is experiencing, whether they feel it as risky, whether it is a social engineering, and even if they're going to accept or not. And why this is interesting? Well, because maybe if we can have a robot predicting what you're gonna do, maybe it could also help you avoiding the most, problematic risks. And this is a collaboration we did with Prof. Kerstin Dotenan in Waterloo, so where we had a food hut robot, and we tried to see whether there were good strategies to induce a change in behavior. And we found out that well, it's not so easy to induce a change in behavior, but when you do that with, for instance, particular rational strategy, you can predict whether the person is gonna change or not the behavior by looking at their facial expression, by looking at how they move the mouse, and even just half of the mouse trajectory is enough to have a sense of what the person is gonna do next. This, however, making robots sensitive is just one side of the coin, because you also want the robot to be able to be communicative. So if you guess right what are the signals that matter, then you can have the robot express them and have a proper communication with the person. So this was a work that we did with neuroscientists, for instance, to express attitudes, how to make the robot move in a way that it naturally expresses aggressiveness versus kindness. And the beauty of this result is that it is absolutely not easy to capture the signature. We tried several times. But if you capture the right features, then you evoke in the brain of the observer the very same activation that you evoke when there's a human in front of their eyes. Which means that even if you have a robot that looks like a robot, if it moves following those important regularities, you can rely on the very same mechanisms in the brain that are in place for human-human interaction. And since human-human interaction is super effective, tapping on those mechanisms for human-robot interaction will bring you a substantial advantage. And it doesn't work only for humanoids, by the way. We replicated this in physical interaction with arm, a manipulandum. And again, not only you have the neural activation, which is interesting, but maybe just more of a scientific curiosity, but you have important behavioral consequences. So if you're in front of a robot that moves aggressively, your brain will make you move aggressively. You don't realize that, and it's very natural. So this means that a subtle modification in the way the robot moves can change drastically the full dynamics of your next interaction. And of course, for the moment, what we are doing is drawing inspiration from the regularities of the motion of humans. I showed you for the let's say, aggressive and kind. We are also studying careful and non-careful movement. Most of our work was originally started by retargeting the movement of actors. But what we're working now is to try and generalize the principles, either finding the model, or by using, for instance, generative adversarial networks to try and capture what makes an action careful or non-careful. And the interesting point is that when you really find the principle, then you're not constrained anymore to using just very human-like or humanoid robots, because you can move slightly further away, capture the regularity, and be as effective with non-humanoid robots. And of course, in this example, I showed mostly communication or expressiveness through movement. But when you have a robot, you have a large array of a source of information that you can use to be legible or predictable. And we explored, for instance, how to reveal, to make transparent to the user the level of learning that the robot has made in the context of reinforcement learning, where usually the learning might look a bit odd from outside and often is not so transparent. And so we tried and use, like, for instance, the way the robot looked around or the way the robot moved together with their facial expression to try and reveal whether the robot was sure, so to say, about the next move, or it was still in a learning process. And what we found out is that it's not that the more is the better. Indeed, we found out that whereas gaze of the robot, either predictive or uncertain, was a very expressive cue to reveal to the participants what was going to happen, facial expression were totally wrong, because facial expression were perceived just as a feedback to what the participant, that was the teacher, was doing. So this reveals that when we are working to make our robot more expressive in some sense, not all movements are the same and not all signals mean the same thing. So there needs to be a systematic and structured understanding of how our brain works to make this kind of communication effective. And if we think that it is important to take into account the human when we are working to improve robot cognition, then probably we have to start rethinking a bit also how we do learning. So, for instance, we explored the possibility in reinforcement learning agents not to just consider classical rewards, but to introduce also elements that are typical for us, but are not so well represented in the RL domain. So think of the mini golf yesterday. I do believe that rivalry was particularly present and is really dominating us when we are competing. So we explored whether introducing rivalry also in our RL agent could make a difference. So this is what I talked to you so far. So the idea that if we want to have a robot that is able to predict us and be predictable by us, we need to make it sensitive and understandable. And leveraging on our knowledge about how the brain of the human works could represent a good systematic way to explore which movements, which behaviors could be successful and which aren't. But this is just, a representation of tiny pieces of a big puzzle, because so far we have just studied single phenomena, one at a time, which gives us super controllability on what is the impact of that particular phenomenon. But this is not cognition. These are, if you want, building bricks for enabling cognition, because if we want to go toward cognition, we need to start thinking in an architectural way. We need to start thinking about action, perception, of course, but then there is so much more. We need internal drives, we need memory, we need internal simulation, and also we need to start thinking how these tiny bricks works together. Even multisensory representation was not very clearly represented in my former part of the talk. And this is where we are slowly heading now. So what we are working on is to try producing very little architecture, for instance, in which we start combining perception and action, but adding an internal motivation. So this is a work by Anna Tanevska, and recently Sara Mungile started to create an internal motivation in the robot that is loosely inspired by the hormonal mechanisms that characterize human behavior. So in this case, it was the very first attempt with a simplified measure of comfort, and the comfort of the robot was varied as a function of the social interaction that it had. So the robot, when it was left alone for too much time, started asking for interaction, and when it was overwhelmed by too much interaction, it refrained from going to people. And what we found out in a very simple scenario in which the participants were just the caregiver is that by enabling the robot to progressively adapt through interaction those thresholds and having this internal drive, we could create autonomous behavior and the progressive personalization to the needs of each caregiver, so that the robot over time started to avoid bugging the person who didn't like to interact with it and started bugging more people who loved to interact with it, even though it was just a unidimensional progressive continuum value guiding its behavior. We have also started trying to address to put this idea of combining action, perception, memory into more structured, or better, unstructured HRI scenarios, so encounters of people in groups, with the idea of enabling the robot autonomously to start learning about the people around it. So getting to know who is facing the robot over time, with the idea of not having a person annotating the name, but rather autonomously collecting facial information, voice information, autonomously, let's say, labeling them by collecting their name, and then progressively building autonomously a data set, and using this data set collected through self-experience to learn better who they are over multiple encounters. This is the work by Giulia Belgiovine and Jonas Gonzalez, and the idea is that by having a robot rather than just a camera, you can really have interactive, proactive behavior. You as a robot can direct the interaction in a way that shapes better the information that you receive from the partner. And this allows you to store in your long-term memory several information, multisensory usual, and then do the training and maybe also forgetting not relevant information over time. So the idea to test this principle was to offer the robot as lab assistant. So people would go to the lab in groups to ask about what's the food in the canteen, or I don't know, are the labs booked for the next week? And then the robot autonomously localized faces and voices and started building a sort of representation of the group and evaluated whether the person was already met or was a new one. And in case in both cases, he saved the voices information and the face information, either collecting it under the label of the name, if it already knew who this person was, or creating new data. And then, once all the users are enrolled, it starts like asking, well, what do you want from me? Do you want to know the canteen? And this allowed over 9 days to collect a nice and varied data set. And I think it's quite representative of what happens in natural human-robot interaction. You meet people that looks differently from one day to the next. They had masks also, light condition are all over the place. Giulia found out that even just retraining the system on the data set that was progressively built out allowed then the robot to recognize decently the people. And it's interesting because this shows that fine-tuning a model for face recognition off the shelf with the first-person experience of the robots brings substantial advantages because it allows you to disentangle the embeddings much better. And they also explore the possibility of forgetting, so the possibility for expanding this kind of exercise for longer than 9 days, where you certainly will need to find a way to establish a sort of continual learning, decide what matters and decide what to leave out. And recently we also tried to reuse the same architecture to a different application supporting adaptation. And so we developed the yoga trainer approach. in which the principle of the architecture is the same, but the robot is showing yoga poses. It's observing in the group the people performing the yoga poses. It was trained by an expert teacher, so it knows how a good pose looks like. And in real time, it provides feedback to the participants to say, oh no, raise your left arm, oh no, your knee is wrong, posed, etc., etc. And this kind of setting or scenario is interesting because, of course, it allows you to test a bit of this real-time adaptation. So the fact that I see you, I see maybe your face, and I see whether you're upset or not. I see your position, and I correct whether you're performing the right thing or not. But if you think of what I showed you before, you also know each of every person, who is it? And you can recognize this person. And then you can start of imagining long-term adaptation. So I start to know which level you are in your training. I start to know, I don't know, how happy you were in performing a particular set of exercise, or which is your good or bad spot in terms of shape and position. And you can try and use this information to provide personalized tasks. And this is the last and maybe more philosophical note, it's of course very important to address the issue of adaptation, both short-term and long-term. But when you do that, it's also very important to be mindful that a robot that is a full chameleon, so that fully adapts to each and every partner, or even to yourself every time you meet it, could not be the right solution. Because we change. We as humans, we change a lot, and we want to predict our partner. So if our partner is too fluid, it's as bad as if it is non-adaptive. So there is this big question on which is the right level of adaptation that a robot should show to make it valuable for long-term interactions. Because if we do what we usually do in experiments, so one-shot meeting, 2 encounters, okay, who cares? But if you start thinking of robots as part of the society, or maybe at home, then you want to have an agent with whom you could interact. And then having a robot that has its own identity, its own self, or its own stability could actually be as beneficial as having a robot that adapts to you. Both elements need to be properly balanced. So this is more or less what I talked to you today. So what I think it's important in the future for cognitive robotics for interaction is to try and address all these 3 components. So humanization, making the robot considerate, knowledgeable about what are the traits that are common to all human beings, what are the regularities, the sensory motors properties that allow natural and intuitive communication with others. And that's something we can model often. Then we need personalization, and for personalization you definitely need an architecture, and this is something that needs to be done and learned during the interaction. So you also need to think on how to learn that in a proper way. And last but not least, the problem of self or identity. So assuming that you know how humans behave, assuming that you know how your partner behaves, as a robot, what drives you? What are the elements that allow to build a unique rapport with the partner that you have? So, as if you need to summarize, all I told you with one sentence is to create more humane robots, where humane does not mean at all that they need to look like us. This is just useful if we want to study human cognition, but it's not the end point. But humane means that they need to be considerate of us. They need to have a model of how we are, what we desire, what we think, and they can then anticipate, predict, and adapt to our needs. And a huge thanks to the group I have in Genoa, to all the collaborations. They are those wonderful people who did all the work I mentioned today. And if you like the discussion, I guess, about cognitive robotics in general, I have to point you to two important initiatives. One is the iCog initiative. It's an initiative that started at IIT, but it's actually an international group of people that are trying to ask themselves how we should design, build, and share a common cognitive architecture for an embodied artificial system. We present iCub as a reference because it's our platform of choice, but of course the question is much wider than that. And we would love to hear more about ideas. If you go on the website, there are already a very nice collection of videos of speakers that gave talk within the initiative. And I hope this will continue in the next year. And the other pointer that I want to make, and it's be an active part of the community of cognitive robotics by joining the Technical Committee of Cognitive Robotics by IEEE ROS. So this is a technical committee, and Michael here is one of the co-chairs, together with Jano, Tetsunari Inamura, myself, and Ayur Korkorsa. So you met most of us today, in these days. It is our aim and duty to try and make cognitive robotics relevant from a technical, from an industry and a social perspective, and from a scientific perspective to actually make bridges with other communities, cognitive science, medical science, and of course, this becomes effective if there is an active group of people, especially young people, that want to share the word about how beautiful cognitive robotics is and how multifaceted it is. Because you've seen how various are the talks that we are having in the school. So if you're interested, just have a look at the website. Actually, the former co-chairs prepared a lot of beautiful resources, and they are Giulio Sandini, David Vernon, and Shingo Shimoda. So you can also find textbook, referrals, relevant publications, and if you think you could make a contribution or help us, please just join us. There is a membership form, or if you have questions, you can write to any of us, and we will be more than happy to provide you an answer. With that, thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, there's already the first. Okay, you know how it works, so okay.
Thank you so very much. You mentioned a study that was very fascinating for me, the pupil dilation to detect lying. So I have heard that pupils also dilate at points of fear and points of attraction. So I guess in the study where you had a human and a robot, attraction would be out of the question. Fear would be something that I sort of, like, I'm not sure if you had a questionnaire that sort of, you measured their discomfort, but did that specifically go for something like a fear element?
So that's a good point. Pupil dilation is actually more specific in a sense that it reflects also arousal. Sometimes it can reflect several phenomena. So our original study, the first one with the interrogation, was really aimed at understanding whether the fact of being in contact with a robot per se would have induced a sort of ceiling effect, because maybe you are in fear, maybe you're aroused, you're engaged with interaction, and so that's enough to... what we notice is that it's not the case. So in a complex and naturalistic situation or scenario, we probably wouldn't be able to tell apart whether it is lie, it is arousal, or it is other. But we can realize that there is something going on. And if we use this kind of approach, the proactive approach I was mentioning, so the idea that the robot is creating a type of interaction where it can formulate guesses about what it should happen, and then it can understand what happens with not 100% security, let's say, but with a good sense. So it's not just you know, in the wild, seeing a pupil that dilates and then, ha, this person is lying. No, it's I create a scenario in which you probably could or could not lie. And then if I see a pupil dilation there, I have a good reason to believe that it might be connected to that. It's never 100% sure, of course. On the other hand, we played a bit with light conditions, for instance, other factors that are physiologically connected with the pupil dilation. And we found out that the delta that you have associated with the cognitive load is comes out. So it's usually more visible than others. But of course, if you drastically change the light and you do a flash, that will be more than enough to cover this kind of signal. So that's why, and I think this holds also for facial expression, for instance. So this idea of understanding what's happening requires context. The robot can provide context, can build the context through its own way of behaving and creating the situation. And this narrows a bit the possibilities of explanation of the phenomenon you're recording. Whereas if you are just passively measuring things happening in the scene, then you need a word of caution more to infer what caused that particular phenomenon.
Fair, fair. Follow-up question on that. The second study that you did after that was showing the same video to other people.
Correct.
And sort of, did you, and I'm just curious about that, did you at the same time question how much did they like the person in the video?
No.
That I think would be in human-human interaction. I think there was a study mentioning that if you like somebody, you don't actually notice if they are lying.
No, you're right. No, we didn't. We just we performed that online, so we were a bit cautious about, and also because the attention span is usually very low, so we minimized at all the questions. But that would have been a nice idea. Okay. No, we didn't. Thanks.
One more thing, and I'm sorry, but like these were very fascinating.
Yes, during the break.
Please use a break. One last question from Micah. So okay, but
thanks.
Out of time.
Yeah. So we had the talk of John Laird yesterday with interactive task learning, right? And we have your talk on social interaction. And it's very obvious that social interaction and interactive task learning, they fit cool together, right? And social interaction should be a tool for getting interactive task learning much more effective, right? So I think my question is kind of what do you see as the big issues in bridging the gap, right? It came up when you have your yoga teacher, right? So. Yeah. And so what does a yoga teacher have the ICAP know about yoga? How does it know, how much does it have to know about what the human knows about yoga, and how does it actually kind of get that? So how does that connect and how can we get that here?
Yes, no, you touched upon a very crucial point. Usually so for people who starts with the idea of studying HRI, then interaction is the goal. Sometimes if I talk with people who start from pure cognitive robotics, sometimes the human is the problem. It's either useless or an obstacle or maybe just a source of information. So I think that the bridge needs to be there. And you're right. I mean, we used a shortcut for the yoga teacher. So the robot was programmed to know what the posture were. So it was teaching by demonstration, but hard-coded teaching for demonstration. So which is a pity. I definitely think that there is this is particularly interesting applied to robotics, even more than general AI, exactly because of the power that the robot has to really proactively induce an interaction. So there is this big question about what the robot should ask, for instance, to be more effective. And I think that this is entirely connected with what we were discussing about understanding the other. Because if you understand the state of the other, if you understand the state of knowledge of the other, if you understand how the other is understanding you, robot, then the way you pose the question, the kind of question you pose when you are learning, becomes completely different. And also, we as humans are incredibly good at adapting, even to platforms that maybe are not perfect. So if we just make the robot good enough to express which are its weak points, we have humans that will be super good at helping its learning. And we found that with children, with the stupidest demo, with the robot that had to fetch a ball, and it was moving, and it was failing because there was an error in the system, and they changed the way they're offering the ball just because they realized what was wrong. So I think that the key point there is really expressing, becoming able to express what the human needs to know. But this, of course, requires understanding the human, which is, the big challenge ahead, in my view. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So now have a nice, exciting discussion during the break. Thank you for being here.